Imagine standing on the edge of a cold northern sea, watching waves disappear into a horizon you have never crossed. Beyond that horizon, there could be nothing, or there could be another world. Around the year 970, the Viking Age was transforming the North Atlantic. Norse sailors had already learned to cross dangerous seas in small wooden ships, carrying families, livestock, and supplies toward distant shores. One of the men who pushed farther than most was Erik the Red. Born in Norway, Erik's family later settled in Iceland. After being exiled from Iceland, he sailed west and established settlements in Greenland. It was there, in this harsh new land, that his son Leif Erikson was born. Leif grew up far from the wealthy kingdoms of Europe. Greenland offered little comfort. Winters were long and severe, farmland was limited, and survival depended on careful preparation. But the sea connected everything. For Leif, ships were not simply vessels. They were the roads of his world. And from his father, he inherited something even more important: a life shaped by exploration, danger, and the belief that there might always be another shore beyond the horizon. Leif grew up in the Norse settlement of Greenland, where survival demanded practical skills from an early age. He learned to handle the cold, read the sea, manage livestock, and understand the ships that connected Greenland with Iceland and Europe. His father, Erik the Red, was the settlement's founder and one of its most influential men. Leif therefore grew up around people who understood that the ocean was both dangerous and essential. But Leif's world was not limited to Greenland. As a young man, he traveled beyond the settlement and eventually reached Norway, where he came into contact with the royal court of King Olaf Tryggvason. There, Leif adopted Christianity. When he later returned to Greenland, he brought the new faith with him. His journey also exposed him to a world much larger than the isolated settlements of his childhood. He had seen different lands, people, ships, and customs. But Greenland remained his home, and the North Atlantic still held mysteries beyond anything he had personally experienced. Then Leif heard about something extraordinary. A sailor had seen land far to the west, land that no Norse settlement had yet reached. The story of the western land reached Leif through Bjarni Herjolfsson, a Norse sailor who had been blown off course while sailing toward Greenland. Bjarni saw unfamiliar shores. He saw forests and a coastline, but he did not land. Eventually, he reached Greenland and told others what he had seen. For Leif, the story was difficult to ignore. He already knew the North Atlantic. He understood how quickly weather could change, and how easily a ship could be pushed far from its intended course. But now there was something beyond Greenland that he wanted to see for himself. Leif gathered a crew and prepared a ship. Around the year 1000, he sailed west from Greenland, following the route toward the lands Bjarni had described. The journey carried the Vikings into waters they had never deliberately explored before. First came a barren, rocky land, which Leif called Helgeland. Then they reached another region covered with forests, which he called Markland. But Leif continued farther south. Eventually, the landscape changed again. There were fields, rivers, forests, and resources that were scarce in Greenland. Leif had reached a land the Norse would call Vinland. For the first time, he and his crew stood on the shores of North America. Leif and his crew did not simply look at the new land and leave. They explored it. The landscape was strikingly different from Greenland. There were forests large enough to provide timber, rivers filled with fish, and wild grapes growing in the region they called Vinland. For people living in Greenland, where trees were scarce and farming was difficult, these resources were extremely valuable. Leif's crew gathered timber and other supplies, and they established a temporary settlement. They built shelters and prepared to remain through the winter. The settlement gave the Norse something they desperately needed, a place where they could obtain resources that were difficult to find in Greenland. Leif's expedition also showed that the journey west was possible. They had crossed the North Atlantic and reached a land far beyond the Norse settlements of Greenland. When spring arrived, Leif and his crew loaded their ship with the resources they had collected and sailed back toward Greenland. Leif had completed the journey. But the story did not end with his return. The new land was too valuable to ignore. Other Norse explorers would follow the route, and some would attempt to establish a more permanent presence in Vinland. The discovery had opened a new chapter in the Viking exploration of the Atlantic. Leif's journey did not end the Norse interest in the lands to the west. The discovery of Vinland showed that the Atlantic could be crossed, and that valuable resources waited beyond Greenland. Other Norse explorers followed. One of them was Leif Erikson, Leif's brother. Thorvald sailed to Vinland and spent time exploring the region around the settlement. The Norse encountered indigenous people living in the area. At first, contact was limited, but relations eventually became violent. Thorvald was killed during a conflict, becoming one of the earliest known Norse casualties in North America. The Norse did not abandon the region immediately. Another expedition, led by Thorfinn Karlsefni, attempted something more ambitious. Families traveled with the expedition, livestock were brought aboard ships, and the settlers intended to establish a permanent community. They remained in Vinland for a time, but the settlement did not survive. Distance from Greenland, difficult conditions, and conflict with indigenous communities made permanent settlement extremely difficult. Eventually, the Norse abandoned Vinland and returned east. Their attempt at colonization had failed. But Leif's original journey remained significant. The Vikings had reached North America. They had explored its coast, lived there, and brought its resources back to Greenland. For centuries, however, the evidence of their journey would survive mainly in Norse stories. Then archaeology would provide something far more powerful: physical proof. For centuries, the story of the Norse voyages westward survived mainly through medieval Icelandic sagas. But stories alone could not prove exactly where the Vikings had gone. Then, in the 20th century, archaeology changed the story. At Meadows, on the northern tip of Newfoundland, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a Norse settlement. The site contained the foundations of timber buildings, an ironworking area, and objects associated with Norse life. The evidence was unmistakable. Vikings had reached North America. Scientific dating placed the settlement around the year 1000, remarkably close to the period when Leif Erikson's voyage is traditionally dated. The discovery transformed Leif's story from an old saga into a chapter supported by physical evidence. The Vikings had crossed the North Atlantic long before European voyages of the late 15th century. They had reached the shores of a continent unknown to most of Europe. But their achievement was different from what happened centuries later. The Norse did not establish a lasting European presence across North America. Their settlements were temporary. Their voyages were limited. And eventually, the Western settlements disappeared from European memory. Yet the evidence remained beneath the soil. And after centuries of silence, archaeology had finally confirmed that the Viking voyages across the Atlantic were real. Leif Erikson's voyage was extraordinary, but his life was larger than the journey that made him famous. He was born into a family shaped by exploration. His father, Erik the Red, had established the Norse settlement in Greenland. Leif grew up in that world, learned to navigate the North Atlantic, traveled to Norway, adopted Christianity, and eventually became one of Greenland's important leaders. His voyage westward was not an accident. It came from a world where Norse sailors already understood how to cross dangerous seas and survive in distant settlements. Leif simply pushed that knowledge farther. After returning to Greenland, he continued his life there and became known as Leif the Lucky. The nickname reflected more than the discovery of new land. His voyage had brought valuable timber and other resources back to Greenland, where they were difficult to obtain. Leif never became the ruler of a vast empire. He did not build a permanent colony in North America. His achievement was quieter. He sailed beyond the known world of his community, reached lands across the Atlantic, and returned safely. More than 1,000 years later, his name remains connected to one of the most remarkable voyages of the Viking Age. But there is one final question. If Leif reached America centuries before Columbus, why did the world forget? For centuries, Leif Erikson's voyage remained buried beneath layers of time. The Norse settlements in Greenland eventually disappeared. The temporary settlement in North America was abandoned. The voyages westward stopped. And the wider European world knew little about what the Vikings had accomplished. Then archaeology brought the story back. At Meadows, the remains of a Norse settlement provided physical evidence that Europeans had reached North America around the year 1000. That was roughly 5 centuries before Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic. Leif Erikson did not establish a lasting colony. He did not conquer a continent. And he could not have known how significant his voyage would become. He was simply a Norse explorer who sailed west from Greenland, followed an uncertain coastline, and reached lands far beyond the world he had known. But that journey changed what we understand about the Viking Age. The Vikings were not only raiders and warriors. They were sailors, settlers, traders, and explorers who crossed some of the most dangerous waters of their time. And among them was Leif Erikson, a man born in Greenland, raised by a family of explorers who sailed beyond the edge of his known world and reached North America nearly 500 years before Columbus. His voyage disappeared from memory, but the land remembered. And the evidence eventually brought his remarkable journey back into history.